I was having coffee last week with an old friend who just achieved the holy grail of his field, a lead article in a top-tier academic journal. You would expect him to be talking about his findings, about the actual truth he discovered, but he wasn't. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline, not about the science, but about the survival. He pulled out 2 documents to show me on his laptop. The first was his original draft lucid sharp, a genuine breakthrough written in clear, biting English. The second was the final accepted version. It was unrecognizable. The clarity was gone, buried under layers of dense jargon, passive voice, and defensive citations of people I know he doesn't even agree with. When I pointed out that the published version was objectively worse, harder to read and less insightful, his reaction completely threw me. He didn't get defensive or ashamed. He smiled, almost smugly, and said, "Exactly, now it looks like knowledge." That instant shift, the pride he took in diluting his own work, hit me hard. He wasn't celebrating a discovery. He was celebrating that he had successfully mimicked a specific aesthetic. He had learned that to pass the gatekeepers, he didn't need to be right. He needed to sound like them. It made me realize that what we call peer review might not be a quality control mechanism at all. It looked a lot less like a test of truth and a lot more like a test of loyalty. And that story, it's really what sets the stage for our deep dive today. We're looking at how peer review, which, is supposed to be this objective filter for quality.
The gold standard.
Exactly, the gold standard. But what if it's really functioning as a kind of an aesthetic filter, a test of loyalty, like you said, to the big institutions and their very specific grammar of legitimacy? So our mission today is to really examine the cost of that. We're going to look at 3 big areas: medicine during the pandemic, social sciences, and economics leading up to the financial crisis.
And in all 3, you see the same pattern. The system is asking, what does an argument need to look like to be considered true?
Right. What happens when the shape of the argument matters more than the actual substance?
Well, it's that distinction you made right at the start, the difference between filtering for, verifiable truth and filtering for, what do you call it, institutional fluency.
Yeah.
And the whole academic system, every field has been taught that credibility only comes after you pass that gate. The idea is that knowledge is legitimate simply because, this was peer reviewed.
The procedure itself becomes the authority.
That's it, exactly. We confuse the process with the authority, and then we stop asking the really critical questions about the filter itself.
Okay, so let's unpack that. This is our section 1. If peer review isn't a pure test of truth, what is this gate actually selecting for? What does that loyalty test look like in practice?
Fundamentally, it's selecting for fluency. But, and this is the key, it's not fluency in the language of, say, biology or economics.
Right.
It's fluency in the language of the academy. It selects for voices that sound like the institution already sounds, for frameworks that line up perfectly with what the reviewer already expects.
So it's not asking, is this real? It's asking, do we recognize this as real?
Precisely. The first question is always, is this presented in the way we expect? Does this fit the script?
Which means, if you're a young researcher, it's not enough to just do good science. You have to perform this specific ritual to prove you belong.
It is absolutely a performance. And the paper itself is judged on its structure first, often before the core ideas are even fully considered. Well, it has to open in the right tone, usually very cautious, incremental, and then crucially, it has to place itself within the existing literature.
Citing all the right names.
Citing all the right names. It's what some call citing for permission, not just for scientific support. You have to show that you understand the hierarchy of the conversation you're trying to join.
That sounds incredibly defensive. Like you have to declare your allegiance before you're even allowed to speak.
It is a demonstration of allegiance. Your paper gets accepted because it speaks the language correctly, not always because it's a breakthrough. And if your findings do challenge the status quo, you'd better wrap that challenge in the approved jargon.
The vocabulary of belonging, as you put it.
Right. So rejection, then, often isn't about the science being wrong. It's a signal of misalignment, a failure of fluency.
So the rejection letter won't say your conclusion is false.
No, it'll say something like, this paper lacks theoretical integration, or the structure isn't appropriate for a top-tier journal. It's a structural critique.
And that's the genius of the system, in a way. It maintains conformity without ever having to say, we're pushing an ideology. They just claim it's about process, about objectivity.
That's the illusion of neutrality. It's the architecture's greatest defense. Peer review claims process, not authority. It doesn't say, we approve this because it's the absolute truth.
It says, we followed the steps.
We follow the steps. And this reliance on procedure, on the anonymity of the reviewers, it lets the whole system speak in the passive voice. This was reviewed by experts.
Right. This was reviewed, not Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones, who have these specific biases, reviewed it. It makes the decision feel like an inevitability, not a subjective judgment.
Exactly. The reviewer is framed as this disinterested agent of science. But who are these reviewers? They're not neutral. They're the most successful products of the very system they're now policing.
So they were trained by the same aesthetic they're now enforcing.
Of course. So when they enforce the form, the tone, the jargon, the citations, that form is already carrying the ideology of the field.
So by policing the style, they guarantee the ideology survives.
It becomes this incredibly robust reproduction mechanism. The system rewards repetition that's just shaped to look like progress. If your finding is too simple, too disruptive, it just doesn't fit the aesthetic. It's why a paper that fits the logic might get accepted even if it explains very little.
While something that's clear and true but uses the wrong vocabulary gets rejected.
Or sent back for years of revisions until it's diluted enough. The core function becomes filtering for familiarity.
Okay, so if the whole system is filtering for familiarity and structural loyalty, it seems like it would be completely unequipped to handle a real crisis. A moment when the old knowledge is clearly failing.
It's not just unequipped, it's counterproductive.
Which brings us right to the pressure cooker of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, this is the central tragedy, I think, of the system's recent failure. The pandemic demanded speed, flexibility, raw, real-world data. It demanded the exact opposite of the slow, aesthetic-driven process we've just been describing.
And the sheer volume of research just broke the machine.
It completely broke it. We're not talking about a small increase here. You used the word tsunami, and that's right. Over 870,000 research papers on COVID-19 were published in 2020 and 2021 alone.
Wow. How does that compare to, I don't know, the flu?
Well, for context, in the 5 years before the pandemic, there were about 109,000 papers on seasonal influenza. So this was an order of magnitude different. The main journals were just inundated.
So how did the big names, the prestigious journals, handle that kind of pressure?
They buckled. I mean, they had to. The Lancet said they were getting 3 times their usual number of papers. The New England Journal of Medicine, sometimes 200 submissions in a single day.
200 a day. That's impossible to manage.
It is. And because the findings were so urgent, people's lives were on the line, the review times were just slashed. We saw peer review cycles, which normally take months, compressed to 48 hours.
48 hours. For an outside expert, that's barely enough time to read the paper thoroughly, let alone check the data or the statistical models.
It's not. You're asking unpaid volunteers to put their reputations on a line with an impossible deadline. And the inevitable result of that speed was a catastrophic drop in rigor.
So more mistakes got through.
Far more. The retraction rate for COVID papers more than tripled compared to earlier virus research. It went from about 0.021% to 0.074%.
Were these just, honest mistakes made in a rush? Or was something else going on?
A lot of it was more than mistakes. It was outright scientific misconduct, duplications, plagiarism, fraud. And this really highlights that core weakness we talked about.
Right.
Peer review isn't designed to detect deliberate fraud.
Especially not on a 48-hour timeline.
Right. Malicious actors knew the system was overwhelmed and they exploited it.
Which leads to the biggest catastrophe of all, the one that actually changed global policy. The hydroxychloroquine scandal in the Lancet. Can you walk us through that one? Because it just perfectly shows what happens when prestige meets a broken system.
This was a monumental failure. The paper was a huge multinational analysis, and its conclusions were dire. It claimed the drug dramatically increased heart irregularities and death in COVID patients.
And people took it as gospel, right?
Immediately. Its publication caused major clinical trials around the world, including the WHO's big trial, to just stop. They halted everything to review safety. A single paper dictated global policy overnight.
So what was the flaw? Where did it all go wrong?
Just days later, the paper was retracted. 3 of the authors had to withdraw it because they said they could, quote, no longer vouch for the veracity of the primary data sources.
And where did this data come from?
It came from a tiny, essentially unknown company near Chicago called Surgisphere, which was run by one of the co-authors.
So a study that stopped global research was based on secret data from a tiny company nobody had ever heard of. How did peer review miss that?
That's the critical failure. The gatekeepers were, it seems, blinded by the prestige of the other authors. One was from Harvard. They were all highly regarded. But Outside experts, the ones who blew the whistle after it was published, saw the red flags immediately.
What did they see?
They saw that the data was suspiciously immaculate. It was too perfect. Real-world clinical data is a mess, right? Records are incomplete, patients are inconsistent, but the Surgisphere data had perfect detail. Race and weight recorded for almost everyone, smoking rates that were identical across continents. It was impossible.
So in the real world, messy data is actually a sign of authenticity. The clean data should have been the first alarm bell.
It should have been. But the reviewers were focused on the polish of the paper, the reputation of the authors, not the raw material. The editors of The Lancet and NEJM, which published a similar flawed paper, had to defend themselves later.
And what was their defense?
It basically boiled down to the structural limits of peer review. They said reviewers don't typically audit the raw data. It's too time-consuming. They're volunteers. When they finally demanded an independent audit after the scandal broke, the CEO of Surgisphere refused, citing confidentiality.
So if peer review isn't set up to check the raw data or to detect fraud, what is it actually doing, besides checking the aesthetic and the technical write-up?
That is the billion-dollar question that came out of this crisis. If you default to trusting the author, especially a famous one, then the system is running on reputation, not verification. The editors basically admitted they just didn't ask the right people. People who work with large hospital data sets and would have spotted the fake data in a second.
They framed it as a monumental fraud from the outside, rather than a fundamental failure of their own model.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the cost of prioritizing that grammar of science over just raw observation. Because at the same exact time, you had other researchers.
Right, the story of Dr. Eris. She saw a real signal but got rejected because her work wasn't polished enough.
That's the other side of the coin. Dr. Eris was working in a hospital in the trenches. She was looking at patient outcomes with a cheap, old anti-inflammatory protocol, something simple. And in her messy, real-world data, she saw a strong positive signal. So she wrote it up and submitted it.
And what did the gatekeepers say?
The Rejection was a masterclass in this aesthetic filtering. They didn't really attack her statistics. Instead, they hit her for a lack of theoretical integration. And get this, for failing to cite the key opinion leaders, the KOLs.
So she hadn't bowed down to the big names who were defining the narrative.
She failed the loyalty test. Her observation was too raw, too simple. It didn't have the layers of complex academic theory they expected. It wasn't dressed in the right clothes.
So her paper was rejected because it was structurally unsound in their view, not because it was wrong.
Correct. And during a crisis that needed fast, practical solutions, the system chose formality and allegiance over a potentially life-saving observation. That delay, rejecting a strong but unpolished truth, has a real human cost.
The cost is staggering. It's measured in delayed treatments, maybe even lives. And it just shows how deep this filtering goes. If this is happening in medicine, where objectivity is supposed to be king, what happens when you apply that same filter to a field that's inherently more ideological, like the social sciences?
Well, in the social sciences, the policing shifts. It's less about data polish and more about policing the vocabulary itself. The gatekeepers enforce an approved lexicon, a set of agreed-upon code words.
Right.
And if you don't use them, it's not seen as a scientific disagreement. It's seen as an ideological one.
And we can see that so clearly in the case of Marcus, the sociology doctoral candidate. His findings just went against the grain.
Yeah. Marcus was doing deep field work on corporate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars.
Yeah.
He was using standard ethnographic methods to see what the actual impact was.
Not just what they said they were doing.
Right. And his data suggested that in some contexts, especially with blue-collar workforces, the specific critical theory approaches they were using were actually backfiring. They were increasing resentment instead of helping.
So he was trying to make the tool better to make it work. But the system didn't want refinement, it seems. It wanted validation.
That's the conflict. Exactly. When he submitted his paper, the reviewers didn't really challenge his data or his methods. They went after his tone, his framing. He was told to recontextualize his uncomfortable findings using the very specific, dense jargon of that field.
So he failed the fluency test. He spoke too plainly about a failure.
And the gatekeepers heard a lack of belonging, not a useful insight. He basically had to bury his sharp, actionable finding under layers of approved jargon to get published.
So the paper got through in the end, but the actual knowledge was lost in translation.
Yes, he secured his place in the field, but the public got weaker, less useful knowledge. Conformity won.
In this linguistic policing, it goes even deeper, right? Down to the legal concept of diversity itself. The argument is that the gatekeeping starts with the very definition of the word.
This is a really deep, critical legal argument. When researchers study DEI programs, they tend to treat diversity as this substantive good. But they often don't question the legal foundation of the concept itself, which was built decades ago in the U.S.
So the problem isn't just that companies are doing a bad job at their diversity programs. The problem is with the legal standard they're trying to meet in the first place.
Exactly. You have to go back to the source. The legal concept of diversity as a reason for race-conscious policies comes from a 1978 Supreme Court case, Regents of the University of California v. Beck. And the crucial thing the court did was explicitly reject remedial justifications.
What does that mean, remedial justifications?
It means they said you cannot use race-conscious policies to correct for past injustices, for historical wrongs. That was deemed unconstitutional.
That's a huge shift. So the focus went from fixing historical inequality to what?
To achieving an abstract educational benefit. Diversity was defined as an individualistic ahistorical value. It was all about getting a robust exchange of ideas. Justice Powell wrote that race could be just one element in a range of factors.
So being from a marginalized racial group becomes legally the same as being, I don't know, a violin player or being from Montana.
That is the legal consequence. The concept was totally diffused, deracialized. In later cases, the court doubled down, saying that trying to fix a historic deficit of traditionally disfavored minorities was just unlawful racial balancing. So the unique experience of a racial minority got equated with having a particular hobby. It's about individuality, not systemic hierarchy.
And that broad, fuzzy definition is incredibly useful for an institution, isn't it? It lets you claim you're complying with the law without ever having to touch actual structural inequality.
That is the core of the critique. The concept succeeds exactly as designed within its very limited legal scope, even as it totally fails to deliver racial equality. Critics argue it was designed to obscure structural racism from the very beginning.
So when these diversity programs fail, it's not just because of symbolic compliance or window dressing. It's because the standard they're complying with is hollow by design.
And peer review in the social sciences protect that hollow standard. By enforcing the specific language of diversity and penalizing researchers like Marcus who point out its real-world failures, the system protects the theoretical status quo. Diversity is allowed to succeed as a symbol because it never truly threatens the existing hierarchies.
So the policing of the language keeps the whole conversation safely inside the lines of what the power structure can tolerate. Okay, so we've seen the price of conformity in medicine-delayed treatments. In social science, it's flawed policies. Let's shift to our last domain, economics. Here, the gatekeeping isn't about vocabulary, it's about mathematical elegance, valuing a kind of theoretical purity over real-world results.
That's a perfect way to put it. In macroeconomics, the gatekeeper is the mathematical form of your model, and specifically whether you adhere to the dominant neoclassical orthodoxy. It's a devastating case study in how an academic aesthetic can lead to a global catastrophe.
And we have the story of Sarah, the economist working in complexity economics, who got filtered out even though her model was right.
Right. Sarah was part of a school of thought that doesn't see markets as these perfect, self-correcting machines. They see them as unstable, complex ecosystems. They're prone to irrational manias, to disequilibrium.
So her models included things like debt and banks and human psychology.
Exactly, the messy real-world stuff. And because of that, her model clearly predicted a systemic financial crisis was on the horizon.
And what did the top journals say?
Rejected. The reason given was that her model lacked elegance and equilibrium proofs. An equilibrium proof is a mathematical demonstration that your model will, if left alone, always return to a stable state. Her model, by design, showed the system was inherently unstable.
So she was rejected not for being wrong, but for not using the approved mathematical tools. Her model wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough.
That's it. And it just shows the sheer power of that dominant neoclassical framework in the years before the global financial crisis. It was the only acceptable aesthetic.
So tell us more about that orthodoxy. What are its core assumptions that made the field so blind?
It really boils down to two huge non-negotiable assumptions that just simplify the messy reality of capitalism away. The first is a total reliance on equilibrium. This is the belief that the economy naturally tends towards stability and optimal outcomes. A recession is just a temporary shock, and the system will quickly fix itself.
And the second assumption?
The second, and this is probably the most damaging one, is the neutrality of money. This idea says that money, debt, and banks are just a veil over the real economy. They don't really matter in terms of output or employment. They just affect inflation.
Wait, If your models are built on the idea that debt doesn't matter and the system is always stable, you've literally modeled away the possibility of a debt-fueled crisis. You've built a massive theoretical blind spot.
A gigantic one. And this framework became what our sources call a monolithic mainstream by the 1950s. It just pushed aside all competing views, like Sarah's complexity economics or post-Keynesian ideas, because they violated those core beliefs. They were seen as not rigorous because they didn't use the accepted equilibrium math.
So the gatekeepers were valuing the internal consistency of these beautiful mathematical models over their ability to actually describe the real world.
100%. The focus was on formalistic models, individual premises. They simply didn't include the variables that were flashing bright red before the crisis. If the model was beautiful on the inside, it was accepted no matter what it said about the outside world.
So while the mainstream was patting itself on the back for all this stability, who were the ignored prophets? Who was getting it right?
That would be the heterodox economists. People working in the post-Keynesian and complexity schools, like Steve Keen and Wynne Godley. Their whole worldview is that capitalism is inherently cyclical and focused on disequilibrium. Their models were built to look for instability.
And what were their tools that the mainstream dismissed as not elegant?
Well, one was Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. Minsky basically argued that stability itself is destabilizing. Long periods of calm encourage risky, speculative borrowing that makes the whole system fragile. His models tried to capture that dynamic.
And Godley's framework.
That was the stock flow consistent framework. You can think of it as forcing national economics to use double-entry bookkeeping. It's a rigid accounting framework that says money doesn't just appear or disappear. If one sector, like the private sector, is going deep into debt, that has to show up somewhere else. It makes systemic imbalances impossible to ignore.
That seems like a pretty fundamental requirement for an economic model. You have to track where the money is actually going.
You would think so. And using these models, the heterodox economists were watching two key indicators that the mainstream completely ignored. The first was sustained sectoral imbalances, meaning the private sector was borrowing huge amounts to fund consumption and speculation.
And the second most critical indicator?
The ratio of private debt to GDP. And not just the ratio, but its growth rate and acceleration. Their model showed that a huge spike in private debt, way above historical norms, was the single strongest predictor of an impending crisis. And that variable was totally ignored by the mainstream.
So while the heterodox model saw rising private debt as the fuel for a giant bonfire, what was the mainstream calling that period from the 80s to 2007?
They called it the Great Moderation. They genuinely celebrated it. They thought their sophisticated models and central banking had finally tamed the business cycle. But the heterodox models saw it correctly as the lull before the storm, where all that debt was just building up pressure for a massive collapse.
It's so clear. The gatekeepers valued the internal beauty of their equilibrium models over the ugly, real-world predictive power of the other approaches. The filtering process ensured that policymakers were basically using a map of a fictional planet while theirs was breaking apart.
It's a profound, tragic example of academic structures blinding themselves to systemic risk. The preservation of the institution's preferred style, its aesthetic, became more important than verifying the truth.
So let's bring it all back together. We have medicine, social science, economics, and in every single case, peer review rewarded a specific institutionally preferred aesthetic, prestigious citations in medicine, an approved lexicon in social science, mathematical elegance in economics. The filter worked perfectly to ensure conformity.
And the societal cost of that conformity is, as we've seen, just shockingly high. It's delayed medical treatments, it's failed social policies that actually make things worse, and it's catastrophic financial crises that blindsided the so-called experts because their vision was filtered.
The system filters for familiarity. It polices the borders of what counts as serious knowledge, and it keeps disruptive but vital insights out. It feels like the very knowledge that is sharp and true has to be dulled and obscured just to get institutional approval.
And that's the challenge for any thinker today, isn't it? You have to recognize this dynamic. Do you mimic the aesthetic of knowledge to get a seat at the table? Or do you speak clearly and risk being ignored because you don't sound like one of them? The real insights, it seems, are often happening outside the established walls of approval. They're not going through the gate, they're moving past it entirely.